Is human design appropriated from other cultures? This came up in the Cosmic Human Design Facebook group, which is founded by Richard Mason and is the system of true sidereal human design. And the comment was, I think it's fascinating to see how many people are so attached to the ownership of HD when it's a system that's been appropriated from so many other cultures. And if the commenter wants to be credited, please post, and I can update the description with the credit. So this question, I mean, it's a good one. It's a good one. I actually, it reminded me of a talk from Rick Tarnas where he not necessarily talks about cultural appropriation, but positions the archetypes and positions Western astrological archetypes in the context of various cultures and looks at cultural understandings of the archetypes. And so Rick Tarnas, for instance, will look at the personal planets, Mercury and Venus and Mars, and even Jupiter and Saturn to a degree, the kind of mundane planets. And what Tarnas does is basically says, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my understanding anyway from his talk is that the Western tropical zodiacal, using kind of conventional astrology systems have a pretty good understanding of these archetypes, or at least have a lot of examples of these archetypes, or have kind of, they're personal archetypes, and the West has always been typified even by Jung or by early writers, sometimes erring, as pointed out in, for instance, in Edward Said's, Orientalism, often erring, but also sometimes accurately as being individualistic and egocentric and self-absorbed and oblivious to the other and things like that, and things that kind of point to the more personal planets. And then on the other hand, we have Eastern cultures, and we have the Vedas, and we have the Vedic religions, and Chinese philosophy, and Chinese religions, and Japanese philosophies and religions, and so on, and these sort of Asian and Indian mysticisms. We have, Himalayan Agora, and we have, or the Nagas, or all these things. And in any case, when you look at these other philosophical systems, it does seem, and I think this was Rick Tarnas's point, that they have an understanding of things like, for instance, death, or ego loss, or all of these transpersonal themes. In fact, this was Jung's thesis, echoed and elaborated on by Marie-Louise von Franz, that, for instance, in India, you could walk in the street and see a corpse and you wouldn't bat an eyelash, because that isn't even a human, because the material is so unnecessary in favor of the spiritual, And in the West, the spiritual seems so unnecessary, right? And they're not. They're not. That person dying in the street should have health care, and that's the Western way. And yet, in the West, the person might have health care, or they might not, depending. If you live in the U.S., they certainly don't. But in any case, the sort of Western values of the material welfare being supported, then in that case, they might have a spiritual deficiency, or a sort of rejection of spiritual values. Now, splitting between material and spiritual is not really the most useful distinction. I mean, I guess in human design terms, that's design and personality. That's all it is, right? So it's simply saying that some places are going to exalt the personality, or still be learning. I like the comment that Jung made, which is very controversial. He's gotten in, and this is, it's interesting to talk about this, because basically what Jung said is that mantras, to sing and chant and do repetitive, counting of beads and prayer beads and all this stuff, have a purpose, and that purpose is to organize and instill order. And this instilling of order is useful if you're having a hard time showing up on time and having a hard time following schedules. It has a lot to do with the relationship to time. And it's so hard for some people And then their relationship to time and their relationship to order, their relationship to routine, they're not able to achieve that order. And so for them, it's very useful to do these sort of rigid, dogmatic practices. And I don't mean dogmatism in the sense that human design is dogmatic, where it says, you can't be both a generator and a projector at the same time, or, a reflector can't have a defined sacral. I don't mean the dogmatism of rules. No, I mean more of, no, it's about the dogmatism of having routine, of having rigidity, of having these sort of inflexible systems. This was really the seven-centered experiment. It was an ancient experiment. It was an experiment that goes back 90,000 years. And that's with the emergence of the seven-centered being against the five-centered being. And for those who know rave cosmology, there's this period of time they kind of coexist, and then the seven-centered being ultimately takes over. And that's what happened. And in any case, the seven-centered experiment of instilling rigidity and discipline and exerting willpower and maintaining structure and order and all of that is echoed in the seven-centered religions of the East, where you count a certain number of beads and do a certain number of prayers and play a certain raga at a certain time of day and a certain time of year. All of the propitiation, all of the, I love Robert Svoboda's Agora books. They're fantastic, and they describe the seven-centered system perfectly. And it's a system that is oriented around the left variable process of making your mind as sharp as possible, of being as structured as possible. And what Jung says is that when you look at places like India, you're going to find a different relationship to time, where time is not as strict as in the West. And so essentially the discipline of the Vedic religion and so on is appropriate or is compensatory, for a sort of laxness. It's a strictness that compensates for the laxness. And I suppose the point being that in the West, the reason why so many people latch on to the yogas and the strictures and so on is because it is so similar, so identical with what we already do in the West, with the 9-to-5 job and with the strictness of time and with the sort of strict relationship and the rigidity and the dogmatism. And so a dogmatic culture can very easily adopt what was a compensation for another culture, a non-dogmatic culture, shall we say. And similarly, the non-dogmatic culture can become fascinated by the dogmatic culture. You see a fascination with Western items in, for instance, India. Okay, so what does this have to do with the question of cultural appropriation in human design? Well, I guess I was just thinking about, these different seven-centered systems, right? Astrology, it's a very seven-centered system. I Ching, seven-centered system. Qabballah, seven-centered. And the chakras are all from the Vedic religions, seven-centered. And so essentially these four modalities that human design is apparently, not actually, but apparently borrowed from. And we'll see why in a minute, why it's not actually. These different systems, they're all seven-centered. So how does something nine-centered emerge out of it, right? We have to change our understanding of the systems. It's really not the same system. For instance, it's not really using the chakras. There's 7 chakras, there's 9 centers. The chakras have very different values than the centers. It's using like the metaphor of the chakras. It's actually a replacement for the chakras. It's a new research program, a different research program. It's a research program for the chakras as centers that does not understand them at all in the same way that the chakras were understood. And yet the chakras are a touchstone, something that can kind of say, oh, well, it's kind of like chakras. The I Ching. Well, this is more interesting because it really shows how the program for the 7-centered and the 9-centered remain the same in some sense. So the program is always going to kind of be seven-centered in some sense. The program is always going to kind of be, I mean, the qualities of the hexagrams change with the passing of the kind of backdrop against the wheel, and also certain deteriorations. For instance, the deterioration of the quarter of mutation. Sirius apparently has already died as a star, but its light hasn't reached us yet, according to Ra, right? And stuff like that. So there's some interesting information on that side of it. But it seems that we have these 4 seven-centered systems that human design has borrowed from or taken from. Well, that's just the appearance, because really, Ra didn't study I Ching. I mean, this is the real question of cultural appropriation, right? This is the question of the collective unconscious. If Jung identifies a myth from a particular culture in the dream or vision of someone from a different culture, is that cultural appropriation? No, because appropriation is absolutely taking from some other culture. And if you believe Ra that he actually did not study these systems and create a new version of these 4 seven-centered systems, if you believe Ra that he actually had his experience, that he actually had his encounter with the voice, I mean, even if you don't, well, first of all, why not? I mean, people have encounters. People have experiences. People have all sorts of interesting, I mean, it's more plausible to me that he had what could be described variously as a psychotic breakdown or an encounter with a, crystallized intelligence or a concentrated, compressed intelligence that transmitted information to him directly in a way that he was not able to understand, so he uses metaphors like words and sounds and colors. I mean, that's more plausible to me than that he researched all of this and just came up with it on his own. Because I've tried. It's really hard. Really hard to try to just put together a bunch of stuff and synthesize it. People try, and I see what it looks like when they try. I see what it looks like when you have that system that has the 4 elements that match to the 4 temperaments, that match to the 4 this, to the 4 that. James Hillman said it best when he said, not all 4s are alike. You can't associate, just because there's 4 fundamental functions, for instance, sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, and there's 4 elements, and there's 4 seasons, and there's 4, you can't associate them. You can't say that spring is fire, and so on. It doesn't work. I've seen it. I mean, I go to the astrology conferences, and every one of them is an astrologer who spent their life putting together these kinds of systems. I mean, not all of them, of course. There are some wonderfully brilliant astrologers. That was a bit hyperbolic. But in any case, it's very common to see attempts to synthesize systems. And the synthesis of those systems is, you could argue, cultural appropriation, because they're actually going out there and taking the system and trying to put it together with another system. And you can argue whether that's good or bad or what the cultural appropriation is and so on. But the fact of the matter is, it's taking another system and it's putting it together. Human design did not emerge that way. Human design was never about someone going and learning the I Ching and mapping it to the planets. It was given. It was given. It was given in potentia, and it took 20 years to unfold, but nevertheless it was given, and it is still being given. As long as we have 61.1 in effect, right now we're at 22 degrees and 55 minutes of precession, according to Ra, and so we have about 6 years left, where it's still being given. I'm being a little bit obtuse here, but I'm referring to the end of the key for, gate 13, right? For memory, for our collective history. According to the human design system, every era has a different key through which we can unlock our storytelling about our history and our understanding of who we are and how we got here. And this is based on the precession of the equinoxes and based on the basically the backdrop that is there at certain key junctures for instance, when gate 13 is active. And right now, we understand history through occult knowledge. The first line of gate 61, occult knowledge. So it's a really special thing. So thinking back now to the question of, there are 7 centered systems. So how is it that they're used? And again, this is more evidence to me that it's not cultural appropriation. Because when you culturally appropriate the I Ching and the chakra system and astrology of any kind and the Qabballah, what you're doing is you're following the 7-centered versions of them. You cannot create a 9-centered version of them out of the 7-centered. Now, the I Ching is the closest to where they're the same, where every line except 54.4 has some relationship to the original Chinese understandings. So particularly with I Ching, but not with the other 3 areas, there could be a claim for cultural appropriation. If Ra, in fact, studied the I Ching, he claims he didn't. He claims he had no exposure to it at all. He claims that he wrote the Rave I Ching, without knowledge of the I Ching. Now, maybe he sat there with the I Ching and maybe he changed it and whatever happened. I mean, I'm not going to devalue it based on that because there's no evidence one way or the other whether he had experience with the I Ching or not. So I'm not going to try to say that, it's more about whether you trust Ra or not, whether you believe his story or you think he made it up about the voice and all of this. Although it seems kind of preposterous that he could have made it up. I mean, I 100% believe it, for what it's worth. But even if you're an absolute skeptic, there's still no way that he was, I guess, to my eyes, there's no way that there could be such a congruence within the system with the 9-centered sort of ideology. Like, I don't see that somebody could basically, like, when you really understand the difference in the 7-centered and the 9-centered, you don't see Capricorn the same way. You realize there's a lot of inherited stuff from Capricorn, for instance. And in my next video, I'm going to look at the gates of Capricorn and kind of connect them between astrology and human design so you can see the 7-centered understandings of Capricorn versus the kind of human design appreciation of it and how that works. But, like, I guess what I'm saying is when you really understand the difference in the 7-centered and the 9-centered, it's hard to call it cultural appropriation because what you would be appropriating would be the 7-centered version of it. And you realize that human design is actually not astrology plus Qabballah plus I Ching plus chakras. That is an oversimplified tagline, slug text to get people interested. It's a marketing line. It's a marketing ploy. There's nothing to do with what it really is because all of those are 7-centered systems. And being 7-centered systems, they have very specific values for the 7-centered that are just not relevant whatsoever for human design. Thanks for watching.